So there's a lot going on at the center. I'm just still working this out. It's brand new. I just bought it. But again, it's a brief presentation. I'm not an expert, so don't be asking me a lot of questions that are going to be streamed that I don't know the answer to. I don't even know what that is. That's fancy. That is fancy. Human trafficking. Individuals who are compelled by force, fraud, or coercion to provide labor or commercial sex are victims of human trafficking. And primarily we're talking about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And the reason why we're talking about making a distinction here with, oh, hold on y'all, with the under the age of 18 is that at that, under the age of 18, it is not considered prostitution and they cannot be arrested for it. So that's kind of why they make that distinction that with under the age. It's still sex trafficking if you're over the age of 18, but that's why they make that distinction. You know, I think one common misconception about sex trafficking in general is that, and labor trafficking to some degree, is that it has to be for money, but it can be in exchange for a bunch of things, right? Safety, food, basic necessities, housing, and so just remember that money is not the only thing that is being exchanged here. Second largest crime in the world, and it has surpassed the illegal sale of firearms to become number 2, and 24.9 million victims across the world. The reason I put this chart up here is it's really breaking down an average age of trafficking, and because trafficking is so broad, right? But the reason I'm narrowing it down, and we'll see a little bit throughout the presentation, is just because this age group, 12 to 14, 15 to 17, these are your primary average ages that people are being recruited into trafficking. That is really young. We should be worried, right?
Hey Sarah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
That you may or may not.
Right. Thanks, Jennifer.
So why that concentration of ages? What makes that group so susceptible?
I'm going to get to that, Jennifer, throughout the presentation.
I'll leave that.
I am. Be patient. I think, well, don't steal my thunder now. The one thing that I think is really noteworthy, too, is that 59% of these victims were trafficked under the age of 17. And these are some of the sort of things that these are the types of trafficking situations that victims who are experiencing homelessness are getting involved in. So primarily we're still talking about sex trafficking, right? All this is basically sex trafficking. We do get into the illicit activities, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Drugs, peddling, begging, panhandling, we'll get to that as well. But 70% is sex trafficking. Now we're getting into the homeless issue. The National Human Trafficking Hotline does a lot of reporting and analysis on data, and that they had figured out that 64% of their survey respondents had reported being unstably housed or homeless at the time they were recruited into trafficking. And so what I mentioned in the previous slide is if we're talking about 64% of people being homeless when they were being recruited into trafficking, and we know that that age group is primarily between 13 and 17, that we're talking about 13 and 17-year-olds being trafficked because they're homeless, basically. Okay, so just homelessness in general, 4 million American youth, young adults experience homelessness in a single year. There have been some studies that have found about 1 in 10 youth ages 18 to 25 experience homelessness, but what's kind of staggering about this is 700,000 of the youth ages 13 to 17 experience homelessness. The reason that number is staggering to me, 700,000, is that those 13 to 17-year-olds are unaccompanied youth. So we're talking about 700,000 homeless, unaccompanied youth between 13 and 17. So 40% of homeless youth are victims of sex trafficking. So I like my numbers, y'all. Y'all should know this about me by now. 40% of 4 million is 1.6 million youth. Advocates and researchers estimate that there's as many as about 2 million youth at risk of experiencing sex trafficking at any given time. In Illinois, in a year, there was just 296 cases of trafficking. And if you think about being underreported, that's only 296. That includes adults and kids. If I take my math a little further, which I always do, take it a lot further, if I'm looking at that, I'm saying, okay, so I divide 4 million homeless youth by the 40%, and then I divide it even by 50 states, that's 32,000 homeless youth. There was only 290, that per state. And some of them are more populous, so think about Illinois would be more populous than a lot of states. 32,000 compared to the reported number of cases, 296. That's a staggering underestimation. It's just staggering. So let's talk about what these youth look like. A lot of the youth, it is estimated by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that about 1 in 7 youth are reported to them as runaways. And they were sex trafficking victims, and also noted a very disappointing statistics as well, that 88% of those children that had been sex trafficked as runaways had been in the foster care system. 88%. And the other studying human trafficking is sad, y'all. A lot of the children weren't even reported missing. So, yeah. Runaway youth are extremely high risk for being trafficked, and researchers have found that running away significantly increases the risk of commercial sex trafficking. And I mean, we know homelessness creates a lot of vulnerability and that kind of instability and the need for survival. You know, they're desperate. 36% of runaway homeless youth trade sex for a place to stay. Between 2007 and 2017, there was a study that had basically indicated that trading sex with runaway homeless youth had gone up 100% in 10 years, and that 36% of runaway youth had traded sex for a place to stay. Really, we're just talking about survival sex, and it's really underreported because often young people do not see themselves as the victims in those situations, and so they're just trying to survive, you know. What other groups do you think might be vulnerable to trafficking? Yep. LGBTQ youth struggle with a lot fewer resources, less employment opportunities, much more likely to end up on the streets and engage in survival sex. And unfortunately, a lot of their being recruited is by their peers, their peer group. And so it's the homelessness, you know, the basic needs, just a lack of a safe place to stay. The one thing about the LGBTQ plus population is that they just have also a lot of less family support. You know, the parents are kicking them out. They're very alienated, and so they're relying on that peer group to help them survive. And often it doesn't go that way. But obviously, girls and women are more likely to experience trafficking. Boys and young men experience labor trafficking, also sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking is a problem. We'll just talk about labor trafficking quick too, because I think that a lot of people don't realize that dealing drugs is labor trafficking. A lot of times that is labor trafficking. They're being trafficked into selling drugs by family members, peers, gangs, because of threats of violence to their family. And there has been some studies that have found that 51% of cases of trafficked youth in labor trafficking were selling drugs. Also, magazine sales. Has anybody had kids come up to your door selling magazines? You catch me, I'm buying like 100. If I can avoid you, I will. But if you get me, I'm gonna get in a lot of them. I've got a lot of magazine subscriptions. Yeah, they could be being trafficked. It is very common, very common. Also, the force to sell drugs, panhandling, people coming up to you sometimes in the grocery store parking lot. That's very common. The panhandling for women, if you're seeing a man and a woman panhandling sometimes, or a man coming up to the woman often, you'll notice that there's some relationship there where she maybe isn't out of his sight for long. That's probably, it could be a trafficking situation. These are just things to look for. Some other common scenarios are like I said, kids selling candy, magazines, trinkets, people asking you for money in on the street, shopping centers. A lot of drug dealing though. The other thing to really look for with the labor trafficking is that when a child is appearing with like a non-parental adult, sometimes that can be a warning factor. If they're being forced to perform work for some other person's benefit that isn't their mom or dad. Traffickers keep kids under tight control. They're always around. So if you're noticing that, I guess I'd be paying attention to that if you're seeing kids trying to sell you things, Also, if they're being labor trafficked, most likely they could also be being sex trafficked. Part of the problem is that I don't think professionals really think about these kinds of labor activities being trafficking. And so we wouldn't recognize that. I surely wouldn't. If somebody came up to my door selling things, the last thing on my mind would have been being that they were being forced into the situation. And so we just don't always realize it. And so it's really hard to help those kids when you're seeing it. But it is an operation of absolute secrecy, and the operations occur underground, behind the scenes, hidden from the public eye. But at least in the one type of human trafficking, like the peddling and the panhandling and the magazine sales, it is at least something that you can see that presents itself. So that in some ways is good, because people who are interacting with them maybe have an opportunity to actually intervene. What reasons, can anybody tell me any reasons they think it might be difficult to identify trafficking victims? Molly, any thoughts?
They have like a connection with the person, right? So if they've been with them for a long time, they have some type of, like, this person is put me in a situation, where like I have things I didn't have before, and so they build some type of relationship with them.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And I think naturally, we're talking about a distrust of outsiders. In some cases, fears of deportation, being able to get, basic needs met, arrest. A lot of times, especially kids, like, teenagers think they know everything. And so when they are involved in a sex trafficking situation that they think they have some control over, and that they're the ones making that decision to engage in that relationship for stable housing, but it is a sex trafficking situation. They just don't understand their own vulnerability and the manipulation that comes along with it, really. They're a very frustrating group of folks to really reach and provide services to, because they're not willing to engage often and self-identify. And also, like was being said, sometimes it just is making the situation a lot worse. So they're like, well, at least I have a place to stay. At least I have food to eat. What is the alternative if I don't have this individual? Like I said, they also don't understand the extent of the manipulation and the exploitation that's happening to them. They believe that the trafficker is someone who really cares about them and is interested in their best interest. So they go really far to protect and cover for that trafficker. There are a lot of other things that go along with being trafficked. And you learn more about this in a more detailed presentation, but there is a lot of like neurobiology that goes along with trauma. Scattered hyper behaviors, flat affects, lack of feeling, just freeze responses, natural responses to trauma in general, but stories come out really fragmented sometimes. Instead of seeing a situation as like a movie, it's more like snapshots in time, so it can be really hard to remember events. And the other thing is, like I said, you can't expect them to be really happy to be rescued, because oftentimes that is not the case. Anybody have any comments about this? That is frustrating.
I had this when I was at in child welfare,
Yeah, yeah.
residential home, and peers were a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was doing research, since being in trafficking is not really my department, I was like, what the? Like, this didn't really cross my mind, even though anytime you have that kind of power dynamic over a vulnerable population, you're always in a situation where something like this is going to happen. But 15% of sex trafficking victims being recruited from shelters or programs or group homes is...
The one place that's supposed to be safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think that recruitment might be happening at shelters? How do you think that might be happening?
They're targeted by the traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
They're seen as vulnerable or weak, and
Yep.
it's easier.
Shelters also don't have any confidential address, so everybody knows where they're at. Because if they didn't, individuals experiencing homelessness wouldn't know where to go. And so traffickers know usually where people are going to go to find housing. The other thing is that traffickers send people into the shelters to try to recruit. So that is a big, people in the shelter are befriending other people in the shelter and trying to pull them into trafficking situations as well, to ingratiate themselves to the trafficker oftentimes. And sometimes if they tried to leave and go to the shelter, and they've decided maybe they want to go back to the trafficker because they kind of had that trauma bonding, then they're like, how how am I going to get in good with him again or her again? And often they're trying to befriend people and take them with them. And so those are some of the ways that people get trafficked in the shelter. Anybody think of any other ways?
I think that people be looking for a way out of the shelter, since the shelter's already a difficult place to be in. If you offer them, well, I can offer you X, Y, and Z, so you don't have to sleep in a room with 50 other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
For getting rid of some of that stress.
Yeah, it's tempting. And now that I think back on the homeless situations where I had that population between really like actually I'm thinking more 17 to 23, because we don't see a lot of those young people. I don't know where they're at. We know where they're not at, the shelter, unaccompanied, because I don't think they can stay there even. And so that's another issue. But part of it too is that we're forgetting is their shelter staff. They get trafficked by shelter staff to do labor sometimes, landscaping, remodeling, repairs, all kinds of different things. Also sex trafficking. Do you want to lose your housing at a homeless shelter? Or do you engage in survival sex? So sometimes you have that situation going on too, that the actual staff are participating in the trafficking of young individuals. Molly, Darcy, how are you going to address this? 700,000 people between the age of 13 and 17 who are unaccompanied and can't stay in a shelter and are homeless. What do we do about that? That's your key to prevention right there, right? Finding your 13 to 17-year-olds before they're recruited into trafficking, shortening and tightening that homeless period, getting them into housing, and where are they staying right now? I'm actually asking. I have no idea. We didn't see many 13 to 17-year-olds. Where are they? Well, we know a bunch of them are being trafficked, right? It's just something to think about in terms of the system, the homeless system that we work in, and how do we accommodate those individuals. Chris, you have some ideas?
Well, sure, we're building a new permanent.
Take it. I was like handing it to you.
Yeah.
Come on. Yep. Yeah, and like I said, there's still some work to do with the 13 to 17-year-olds, but that's huge progress because that has been a shortcoming in the homeless system for a really long time. And honestly, you don't want to put a 14-year-old boy in a men's shelter. You just don't want to do that. And so there's still some things to work out here, but this is the group of people that you would want to be focusing on to try to shorten that homeless stay or prevent it altogether, right? Identifying trafficking victims. I just put some things up here that are just maybe questions to ask that wouldn't necessarily, I don't think they translate straight from you don't have these kinds of questions necessarily on the VI SPDAT, right? This could be maybe something you add to your assessments, some questions that you add to some of your assessments, not the VI SPDAT, it's an evidence-based tool, but there are some questions that you could ask that might get a clearer picture of what some of these homeless situations look like for youth. So like I said, received anything in exchange for sex? That's kind of the big one. Is someone asking you to lie while speaking about the work you do? You feel unsafe, scared? Somebody threatening to deport you? Somebody threatening your family? You? I actually had to go to the hospital for a medical advocacy about maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was a a young woman, a teenager, who'd been assaulted, and her mom was with her, and two siblings in the other room that were safe, and they were just staying there because they didn't have anywhere to go. But they were only Spanish speaking. They've only been in the U.S. for 3 months, and so that communication was obviously really complicated. Also, the youngest child was kidnapped, and so that was a whole other situation that we were dealing with because that was a really young kid, 5-year-old or so. And so there were a lot was going on at one time with this advocacy when I'm talking to this family through a translator. And in walks some random dude into the hospital, and the nursing staff and the staff let him in, and they came in and said, you know, Jose's here. And I looked at mom, and mom looked at me, and she's like, I'm like, you don't know who that is? She's like, mm-mm. It was explained a little more that it was somebody from her work, and she was like, okay, fine. This is what traffickers do, though. They show up. They show up to the hospital because they want to take people home. They want to be present when questions are being asked. They want to be able to provide the answers, and they want to take that person home with them. And in this case, there was not trafficking happening. But my point is, like, I was freaked out. I was like, this looks like trafficking written all over it. In walks this dude who's just claiming he knows these people, and she's kind of like, huh? But what had happened was it was so complicated of a case that police actually went back to her employment where an altercation had taken place, and he happened to be there and had been part of trying to protect her during that altercation. And so that's how DCFS had nobody to call. She didn't have a phone, and so they're grasping at straws on who to find. So they kind of pulled him in, but at the time I said, you can't let him in this room with their family. We don't know him. He's not family. We don't even know that she really recognizes him that well. And so, but that's what happens. You need to question these things when people are just popping in and claiming some ownership over people, because that's what the traffickers do. They come in and they try to disrupt the situation and get people home. Another thing that I read while I was kind of putting this together real quick was that folks who have been sex trafficked often have been to the hospital more than 9 times during that period of time. And so there obviously needs to be some better advocacy and questioning that goes on in hospitals. But yeah, they are touching so many service providers at one time and going just, you know, they're just under the radar and nobody knows they're being trafficked, but they're having a lot of contact with social service and hospitals.
So I've seen some ads, and I don't know if the rest of you have seen them on TV, about a woman who is giving a gesture, which is supposed to mean help me.
Mm.
Have you guys seen that? I don't remember what the, yeah, it's like this.
Basically, you put your thumb in, and then you,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is that something you guys talk about?
No, because that's not an official. Not
And
really.
there's also, like, there's another ad, I think, where somebody is sitting at a table with their abuser, and they drop something, and there's a note on it that says help.
Yeah.
Do you guys talk through, like, what are some of the cues that we would be looking for, or maybe that we should know?
I mean,
You said that's not an official.
In terms of cues where somebody's literally asking for help, that's
Yeah.
pretty rare.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that whatever that TikTok symboler was or whatever in that one case, that is not a,
Internationally recognized.
it is not at all. It just helped her, and thank God. So maybe it will become one, but not really. We're not often in an opportunity to intervene at that level beforehand,
Yeah.
you know? And so I think just paying attention to any signals that looks like somebody's having a problem or uncomfortable, especially if it's a child and they're not with a parent. You know, those are the things to really look for. Good question, Jennifer, that I didn't have a good answer to, but thank you.
Maybe that leads into, like, you know, what can we do? So after this presentation, I'm thinking that little kid that comes to my door selling candy, I'm sure it's probably not cool if I just, like, grab him and lock the door. Right? Like, probably shouldn't do that, but, like, what can we do?
Well, in just in terms of their needs in general, I would say that you're always talking about housing. right? Housing is kind of the big boy when you're talking about the volume of youth that are unstably housed and potential human trafficking victims. So I would say just in terms of needs, you're talking about food, medical, safety, things that are making them feel safe. A lot of times the interpreter services are big, counseling, the public benefits, the legal status is a big one for folks trying to overcome that barrier. When I was at the hospital with this woman, she said, I was really scared to come here because I didn't know what was going to happen. I know I can't communicate. She was in a really tricky situation, but she still came, thank God. So these are kind of some of the things they need. In terms of immediate, some other interesting things I dug up were that a lot of survivors surveyed. One of the services they really wanted that was hard to find was parenting classes. Young women had been trafficked. They have families. They have kids now. And parenting classes was kind of one of the big resources that they were looking for. So that was a big one.
I'm gonna go back to your question. Like if you see something, say something. Who would we say something to?
Yeah.
Yeah, would that be a call to 911 with a description of the person, this is the location, I don't know if there's anything going on, but, ... Is that what you, and you would say, what?
She's telling you that's what she got on the slide.
All right.
You and me are on the same page. Yeah, I would say locally, you call the center. We have a hotline 24/7. You know, we'll go out and investigate it. We have a human trafficking department. This is what they do. We have outreach workers. We have APS workers. We have people in the community all the time. Molly, Darcy, the outreach team is a really good resource to send out to investigate as well. If you feel like somebody's having a problem or an issue, sometimes that panhandling call turns into more than you think. It could be a trafficking situation, or there could be some other things going on. But there is also the number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So you could also make a call there. For kids, we always do a DCFS report, usually, well, depending on the circumstances, but that's a big one too. Not everybody in here is a mandated reporter, but for the individuals who are, that would be something to be mindful of, is making a DCFS case. Nothing hurts your heart more than like when I had to call DCFS on this family whose kid was assaulted, who doesn't speak English, and whose other kid has been kidnapped. But we sort through all that, and that's just part of the process. So these are your primary resources. Our hotline, homeless outreach team I should have put up there, the national hotline, and DCFS. Any questions?
I'm still stuck on the question you asked of where are these kids going? You know, and as much resource and expertise as is here, and still nobody knows, that's really troubling.
Yeah, I mean, I would
Going
say.
forward tomorrow, how do we figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is really starting to recognize the signs of it. It can be really hard to recognize it when you don't have the experience with it, though, right? Like, it's hard to kind of pick up on all those nuances in that subtle and coercive communication and interaction between individuals. I would say that maybe Molly and Darcy would probably be good, and Christina, good people to ask about that. But I would say some starting points would be, I can think of some individuals now stepping back from it. A young man who had just come out of the foster care system, became his own payee, was living in a room with like 12 other people in the basement of a house. He's housed. He has nowhere else to go. He has no family. He's coming out of the foster care system. And I'm like, thank goodness this dude has a place to stay on some level, you know. But he could have been being trafficked. And so you don't see those individuals very often, though, because they are in housing. So they're not accessing homeless services. They're just in unstable housing. And so they're just flying under the radar because you're not seeing them. They're just surviving just enough. And they're not disclosing. because of all the reasons we talked about, but they are touching social service providers. They're going to the hospital. We are seeing them on the homeless team. We're just not seeing them long, and then they disappear. The youth, you just don't see them much, you know?
I had one where I was doing outreach at the rescue mission, and a dad just dropped his 17-year-old off. I'm tired of dealing with you.
Yeah.
Dropped him off at the mission and said bye.
Lovely.
The mission literally sat here going, we can't take him. He's too young.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't know who to call. So that's the other problem is
Mm-hmm.
if that happens where a parent just goes, bye, I'm done dealing with you, like they did with this kid. I mean, the kid just sat there like, what am I going to do? And I'm like, well, we can't just throw him back to the streets and let the wolves get him. So it was a scramble at 5 o'clock in the evening trying to figure out what to do with a 17-year-old kid that his dad just dropped him off and left and said, peace be with you, son.
Yeah.
And that's the other issue. The other issue is a lot of those 13 to 17-year-olds are also doing a lot of couch surfing.
Oh,
So
yeah.
they're
Absolutely.
homeless
Yep.
in the sense of the school's mind.
Yep, definitely.
They're not with their parents.
Yep.
They're with a friend. They're with their friends' friends. Their friends' parents.
Yep.
The random stranger that just happened to be nice enough to not let them stay on the streets that night.
Or
So-
a charming new partner who is grooming them for,
Yeah, or
trafficking,
an 18-year-old who's now,
you know?
But they're hard to find because
Yep.
they're kind of hiding in plain sight.
Right, right. Go ahead.
What's sad is that a lot of, when you're in DCFS, a lot of foster homes will not take in a problem teenager
Yep.
these days.
Hard
They don't look
placements.
for the babies, and that's a big, huge problem. I mean, if it wasn't for Hoyleton Youth and Family Services at that time, I don't know where I would be,
Mm-hmm.
honestly.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
that's a big problem, and then now you got young teenagers that are runawayers
Mm-hmm.
and that are just going behind the surface.
Yep. 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 It's a really tough age group to serve from really any social service provider, honestly. Yeah. So, is any other questions? Okay. I kind of feel like maybe this is a little bit of a downer. Sorry, everybody. But my bad. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it is. I hated putting this presentation together. I'm like, oh, God, every part of it is just unpleasant to talk about. But I think the reason to talk about it is that I think we forget about this vulnerable group as homeless providers because we're not seeing them. And we don't have the systems in place to really support that group. And they are the most vulnerable to trafficking. So the young people, LGBTQ, kids coming out of the foster system, homeless individuals, those are the people to really keep your eyes on in terms of trafficking and trying to maybe make a priority in terms of housing, which you are doing in your new apartment building. So
Has there been any studies about kids getting lured from their homes, like foster homes and stuff like that? So they are now homeless because they're running away from that foster care, but they ran straight to
Yeah,
an abuser?
absolutely.
Like what are those numbers looking like? Do we know that?
they don't necessarily quantify that in the runaway homeless youth numbers. You can't tell
Who's being lured
if
away?
they're
'Cause I know
what
that-
they're running away to, what they're running away to.
'cause I know, like,
Except we know some of them are going to
we
shelters.
found like the app Grindr has actually been showing that it's been linked to a lot of abuse of the youth of LGBTQ because
Yep.
they're looking to their peers for guidance,
Mm-hmm.
and now they're getting abused by their very peers just through this
Absolutely.
app that they thought they were
Yeah.
looking for somebody to help
Yeah.
guide them in this world.
Yeah, I mean, your number one, probably most victimized, susceptible to trafficking group is your 13 to 17-year-old transgender. That is your 100% most vulnerable group, for sure. Yep. Any other questions? That's all I have. I thank you for letting me be here. Appreciate it.
Want to rattle off the new total?
No, go ahead. I don't want to steal your
Before we
thunder.
Close the most depressing session ever.
You are welcome.
So we are currently at $90,450.91. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450. 90,450
reminder that this room stays open all night for those of you that are sleeping in your vehicle.
Totally fine.